Hello, my name's Dan Brown, Brandon Bohan, Alex Blows, Tom Farrington. Today we're going to be talking about Vietnam. I'm going to be talking about why the USA got increasingly involved in Vietnam. Main reasons are containment, domino theory, South Vietnamese weakness and retaliation from the Viet Cong. So in terms of containment, the US didn't want the spread of communism to enter Vietnam. They wanted to keep support of France against communism, so they increasingly got involved with the Viet Cong and wanted to repel them. In terms of domino theory, if Vietnam fell to communism, then Laos, Cambodia, Burma, Thailand, and possibly even India might also fall, just like a stack of dominoes. In terms of South Vietnamese weakness, they could not repel communist infiltration by the Viet Cong without help, mainly offensive and ill-equipped militia. So they weren't very advanced. They had technological weakness, and they didn't have very good tactics. When the Viet Cong retaliated, the North Vietnamese had attacked the USS Maddox in August 1964, then killed US soldiers in 1965. This spurred the USA to fight more. So when the Viet Cong directly attacked the USS, they decided to get increasingly involved to try and repel them.
I'm going to be doing why the USA failed militarily. Firstly, the US had bad tactics and preparation. They had highly trained soldiers at the start of the war, but soldiers gradually became new recruits. America also ended up getting huge war debts and had no support from the locals as they were seen as imperialists. The American soldiers were supported in the Catholic urban minority, and they were supporting a corrupt government. Soldiers had no experience in and were not prepared for jungle warfare. They were used to winning wars in Europe and Africa on open ground. This put the Americans at a huge disadvantage. Bombing techniques and Agent Orange also scared Vietnamese soldiers, but failed to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail as it passed through communist areas of US allies like Laos, Cambodia and South Vietnam. As the US allowed media in, unlike the North Vietnamese, the US public knew the horrors their side was committing and all the defeats. The North Vietnamese public thought their side was always winning and knew little about the massacres they were committing. America was also bound by the Geneva Convention. The Viet Cong were free to do anything they wanted. America could also not invade North Vietnam in order not to anger the USSR. Viet Cong tactics. The Viet Cong had support from the local population and understood their grievances. The Viet Cong also had no uniform, so could disappear into a civilian population after attack, and they were respectful towards the peasant Buddhist majority. The Viet Cong also had reliable supply lines along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They had forest cover, which meant supply caravans were incredibly hard to spot, so bombing was often random. Soviet ships in the South China Sea also warned communist troops of impending attacks. The Viet Cong also had motivated and committed soldiers who were dedicated to unification and communism. They could also sustain heavier losses than South Vietnamese forces without giving up, and were fighting on familiar terrain. Finally, they had effective hit-and-run tactics, attacking the Americans at night to demoralise them, and hiding in tunnels to avoid bombing, leaving behind spike traps and mines during the day to kill American patrols. They also had no uniforms and so were unidentifiable from civilians. Another factor was Soviet and Chinese support. The USSR secretly stationed over 3,000 troops in Vietnam, including lots of arms and ammunition. They spent $450 million in arms to North Vietnam each year. Russian schools also trained North Vietnamese soldiers. China also gave North Vietnam over 90,000 rifles and guns, as well as a lot more equipment. In my opinion, the most important reason were Viet Cong tactics, because they allowed the Viet Cong to hold off the Americans and fight on despite heavy losses. They also caused the American media to see the war as unwinnable, and caused the withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam, and soon after, the victory of North Vietnam in the war.
Why was the war in Vietnam so unpopular? Well, the key factor was the military defeats. The blunder at Saigon during the Tet Offensive raised serious questions as to how the Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong managed to get past all the US troops in Saigon and managed to infiltrate their embassy. Media coverage didn't help at home. At every opportunity, the media showed the US people all the horrors that were going on in Vietnam, whether it be the consequences of US actions or the horrors that the Viet Cong inflicted on them. As the public saw the result of the Tet Offensive and the My Lai massacre, they began to think whether it was worth killing all their own people just to get what they wanted. There was the protest movement. The protests at home were damaging to the war effort. The student protests against napalm research caused an uproar in all the colleges in the US. The police response was brutal, and this coverage on the news created national opposition to Johnson's government. A significant reason why the war was so unpopular was the factor of media coverage. At every available opportunity, the public had the horror of the war thrust in their face. It was everywhere, and all they saw was the horrors of their troops dying, families dying, and Vietnamese getting killed everywhere. They knew the horrors of Vietnam and they wanted it to stop, and they saw examples of the napalm strikes, the My Lai massacre, and Saigon.
So now on to why the Americans withdrew from Vietnam. One of the reasons was because of failed tactics. The American soldiers had very little experience and were not prepared for the jungle warfare. They were used to fighting wars in open and where you could easily use guns, but this was more about ambushes and attacks. Another reason they were failed tactics was because of the tour of duty system. This meant that when soldiers got experience, they were allowed to go back home because they had done their duty. Another thing was because of failed bombing techniques and Agent Orange. This meant that they could not stop the Ho Chi Minh. Now moving on to why domestic opposition was a reason for the Americans' withdrawal. The civil rights campaigners back home had been fighting for black equal rights for a number of years, and the Vietnam War highlighted racial inequality as 30% of African Americans were drafted in comparison to 19% of white Americans. Another movement back home was the student movement. The American student movement opposed the war. Many of the young people refused to go to war as they saw it as morally wrong. This was a bad thing for the government as they were the next generation to come through, so their lack of their support would be crucial. Another reason was financial cost. There were nearly 500,000 troops in Vietnam, and the USA was spending over $20 billion a year on the war. Now moving on to the judgment. In my opinion, the biggest reason for American withdrawal was because of the failed tactics. This impacted the other factors such as domestic opposition and financial cost, as the US were losing many of the battles that they fought in. As I said earlier, the soldiers had very little experience, which meant they lost financially because of human cost and economic cost.